Hi, I'm Allie with the Potomac Bead Company. I'm going to show you how to do basically a diagonal stitch bracelet using Tila beads, and it's called the Tila Path. For this bracelet, I'm using Tila's. The color that I chose is opaque cobalt. I'm also going to be using a mix of 11 beads. These are delicas, but you can use any type of beads. I have a mix of blue Swarovski crystals. I have wildfire beading thread, 0.006, and I also have Lance English beading needles size 10. To start out, I'm just going to be working just by themselves with the Tila beads. The fringe that I add after the fact will be done after the bracelet is completed. To start out, what I've done is I've cut about 3 feet of beading thread, and I've actually made a stop bead on my bracelet. A stop bead is a bead that stops your thread from falling off, and it usually is a 6/0 or an 8/0 bead that is different from the beads that you're using. That way you know where your bracelet has started. I add a Tila onto my thread and drop it down to my stop bead. I take my needle through my Tila bead, and I sew down the opposite way through the next Tila. And all that's going to do then is have just one Tila on my bracelet. The next thing I do is add another Tila bead, and this Tila is going to sit right next to the Tila before it. To make it sit right next to it, if you hold it into place, you can see how you need to sew it. I'm going to sew through the second hole of the Tila before it in a downward fashion, and that's going to pull my beads right next to one another. I sew back up through that first hole that I just put on the second Tila, and I'm going to get ready to add another one of my Tila beads. There I have it. I'm going to go ahead now and add my next Tila, and this is my first row. Now I'm going to be doing my second row. To do my second row, I add the other Tila. And because it's going to sit in a diagonal, they're not going to line up completely square. I could do another bracelet like that, but what I'm going to do is actually turn it to its side, so that way it almost creates a triangle shape. I sew through one side of the Tila bead, now I'm going to sew through the other. Then I continue to sew down through my last row. My last row for this one, because I'm only on my second, happens to be my first row. But as I add the third row, I'm going to sew down through the second row. I sew up through the next hole of the first Tila, and I'm going to add my next Tila. As you can see, this starts that zigzag pattern that gets that path shape. To hold that in place, I'm going to sew back through my last hole of my first Tila. So I'm doing the exact same thing that I did on the first row, and I'm sewing down. That's going to hold the bead in place. To continue, what I'm going to do is sew back up through. So I'm doing a big loop, and now I'm ready to add my third row of Tila beads. And I'm going to get ready to add this Tila bead as well here. Again, forming my triangle. And I'm always adding, if you're looking at it in a diagonal, the first bead I always add is the bottom Tila. I have one through. Now if you look at it, you think I need to get another Tila bead right here. You're going to sew up through that last bead, anchoring this one in place. And if you know seed beading, it's actually just right angle weave. It's just a little hard to keep track of sometimes for people because the Tilas do have 2 holes. Again, I'm going to add my next bead, and it's just a lot of figure 8s going on with the thread underneath. Okay, I'm to the end of my bracelet doing that diagonal stitch, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my fringe. To do that, I'm just going to pick up a random 11/0 or delica seed bead, and then I'm going to pick up a crystal, another seed, drop it down next to my bracelet, and then I'm going to skip over that last bead that I added, and sew back down through the crystal and back down through the bead. what that's going to do is position the delica so it's right on top of the crystal, and that's my first little loop right there. That's my first fringe. Next, what I do is I sew back down through the next bead. I'm going to add my seed bead. I'm going to add my next bicone, and I'm going to add another seed bead. Again, same pattern. I'm sewing back down through the crystal, back down through the first seed bead there. And I'm going to be bringing my needle up now for each pass, up at the end of the Tila that I'm going through, and back down that same Tila on the other hole. And it can get tight. It's a little bit hard sometimes to get your needle in there. And back down to the end of the next Tila. And then when I get here, I'm going to add my next piece of fringe.